The date, September 15, 1915. That is the date that would have changed our great-uncle's life forever. It was the date that he enlisted along with thousands of other men in the Canadian Expeditionary Forces in the First World War at Niagara Camp in Niagara-on-the-Lake, Ontario, Canada. What was the motivation to enlist? Was he scared? Did he think of dying? Was he really ready to sacrifice his life? Or did that even cross his mind? What were his experiences? And what did he and other soldiers endure at places where they trained, fought, and died? Is he and his fellow soldiers remembered and honored in faraway places for their sacrifices? What was the lasting impact of the Canadian Forces upon the communities where they trained and fought? To help answer these questions and a host of others, two brothers, a sister, and a niece traveled to various locations where a relative trained, fought, was treated for gunshot wounds, and where he ultimately died and was buried. This is the story of our great uncle, Robert Joseph Cook, a small town Ontario young man, and the courage shown, which represents the story of many thousands of other Canadian soldiers across Canada in the First World War. Join our journey as we tell the stories we crossed 2 continents and 3 countries, from military training camps and cemeteries, national monuments in Canada, the UK, and France, as well as through his military service records and battalion war diaries, and interviews with military historians, museum directors, Ministry of Defense staff, and historical national monument staff.
The Canadian Expeditionary Force was multinational. There were soldiers in the people from America joined the Canadian Expeditionary Force. People from Belgium joined, from Russia, from Poland, everywhere that immigrants to Canada came from joined up in the force. It was one of the first truly multinational armies. They joined for various reasons. Most of them were volunteers until right near the end of it, but they joined for very different reasons. Lots of Canadians did join because of King and Empire. They were patriots in that. Lots of them joined because they wanted to get back home. Wages on the prairies in Canada were not as high, and they couldn't afford to come back, and they wanted to come back home. So they joined up because they would come back. The war was going to be over by Christmas, so it's like, get to Britain, leave the army there, and join. A lot of them came up. A lot of them stayed. So there is that. There is patriots, wanted to King and Empire. They joined. The Americans joined. People wanted to learn to fly. The easiest way was join the Canadian Expeditionary Force, transfer into the Royal Flying Corps, and you can learn to fly. We have lots of examples of that. There's no one single reason. Some thought it would be a bit of an adventure.
So I'm here on the grounds of the former Camp Niagara. So this would have been where our great uncle Robert Cook would have enlisted. He enlisted in September of 1915, and it appears that through his military records he was only here about a month before his battalion, the 35th, shipped out to Montreal. They spent a little bit of time in Montreal, and then they shipped out again all the way to England. So, and ultimately his battalion landed in Folkestone, UK, in Kent, and they trained there for about a year before they were shipped overseas to the Vimy Ridge area.
So the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum has a collection that ranges from the early neutral nations up to, present-day history. But we do have a focus in Niagara Camp and the First World War, of course. So the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum actually, when it was first established, was right on the edge of the Commons, which is where a lot of the soldiers were training. And a lot of the soldiers actually came in and checked out the museum, looked at the collection and the exhibitions. And fortunately, even today now we have a collection relating to their time here, which includes panoramics of the battalions here, some bell tents, we have banners from when they played some of their sports tournaments, we have trophies, buttons and cap badges, and a variety of World War I collections.
So on the eve of the First World War, Niagara Camp was chosen as a site for the Canadian Camp. Again, because it had railway access, boat access, and by this time it was a major highway into the area, so it was an ideal training site. So 1915 was a very big year for Niagara Camp. There were approximately 20,000 men. In 1916, again, there were some 16,000 men trained. So the men on arrival in camp, again, would march to their site that was designated to them, usually led by their military band, and then they would set up their canvas tents. These were called bell tents. They were canvas tents, which would have either 8 or 9 men with their heads out towards the perimeter, and they would each have a ground sheet and a straw mattress, which is called a paliassa, and if they were lucky, 2 or 3 blankets. In the morning, they would be assigned to various exercises that might be to bayonet practice or grenade practice or marching, whatever. And then at noon, they would have, usually their big dinner was at noon. Then they would have a short rest period, and then they would be expected to have another series of routines. Again, bayonet training, marching, again.
So, good morning. My name's Chris Shaw. I'm the chairman of Shorncliffe Trust. Welcome to Shorncliffe. Shorncliffe is a very old army base down on the south coast of England in Kent by a town called Folkestone. And it's been an army base down here for over 200 years. The reason that it's here is because it's just across the water from Boulogne and France. Its significance to Canada is, well, this is where your story starts. In 1858, the 1st Royal Canadian Regiment were presented their colours by the young Prince of Wales, who was Victoria's oldest son and was go on to be the king. It was his first official duty in his uniform. He handed the standard to the Royal Canadian Regiment, and he said, with this standard, go build a nation. They then said something which is incredibly important to Canadian history and to the Canadian people and our relationship between Canada and England, Canada and Great Britain, between our community here at Shorncliffe and communities across Canada, between our families and your families. The Royal Canadian Regiment, their commanding officer, made a promise. He said, if you ever need us, we will come back with regiments tenfold. Canada, you kept that promise numerous times. You have kept that promise and paid with your lives and paid with the lives of your families, your grandfathers, uncles, numerous times.
I mentioned briefly about the training at Shorncliffe because that's what the garrison was for, in the garrison area. The garrison area was huge. It stretched from New Romney, which is down there, to Canterbury, both a vast area of training, and all of it, to a greater or lesser extent, was used for training. The main training area, almost certainly Tolsford Hill, which is toward West Handling, a little bit north of West Handling there. They learned different skills in different places. Hythe was musket training with rifles. They trained with the bayonet on St. Martin's Plain. They learned about how to handle certain weapons of Western Hanger. They learned to dig trenches. at one of the farms over there, Blackbush Farm, Blackshaw Farm, over there. The training was all over the place. There was a lot of group marches. They marched from their camps to Canterbury. Bunker Hill outside Canterbury was a training area. On the way to up the road there was another. Each area had a more or less specialist role. They learned to dig trenches in one place. They learned to throw grenades, bombs in another. Training was intense, and a lot of it may seem pointless, but it's necessary to weld soldiers together. They must know what the other soldier's going to do. They must try and learn how to cope with different situations. So they learn all that in various different places. There is evidence that they learned to train down here too. There are photographic evidence, but that doesn't discount most of the training occurred away from what is now the Shorncliffe Garrison.
Behind me are the gates down Sandy Lane that all the Canadian soldiers walked through when they wanted to go and start learning how to fight in World War I. Behind us, the Canadians created an amazing, living, immersive battlefield. Trenches, shell holes, mine holes. They learned gas attacks, defense attack, the German trenches, German pillboxes. Steve Head, who is our trustee and leading sort of historian, is going to talk to you about what he's uncovered here at Shorncliffe.
Well, I'm standing in a trench at Shorncliffe. Why are these here? Well, learning processes. From 1916 onwards, following the events of the Somme, the British were desperate to learn how to fight this war, this industrial war, this war of gas and shells and machine guns, this war of untold carnage. How can we remove the Germans from their very well defended fixed positions? Germans didn't want to move. They were happy where they are. It was the British and the Canadians and the South Africans and the Australians and the New Zealand's job to get them out. So the small magazine Lee Enfield 303 rifle is the rifle that would have been carried by the Canadians into battles like Vimy, etc. If you were to earn your keep, you needed to fire 15 rounds, aimed rounds a minute. To load, bolt comes back. For this purpose of this demonstration, I'm just going to use 5, and these are practice rounds, they're not real bullets. They're in a clip, place it into the carriage, thumb over the top, take the carriage out. And then the round goes forward into the from the magazine, and it's ready to fire. Your firing pin comes back, you aim, fire, draw the magazine or the bolt back, your empty clutch comes out. Next one goes in, fire. Next one comes out. Now, to do this as a soldier would do it, they would do it in a smooth action from the shoulder. Fire. Done. And you'd have 10 rounds in your magazine. 150 rounds a minute, or 150 rounds aimed shots. You have 150 rounds on your body.
We have 310 Canadian war dead, and we've also just recently found out there was another Canadian who died in the 1800s, who's actually buried here at the top of the cemetery.
The cemetery itself is basically split into two for research purposes. The officers are up here and the soldiers are down there. The officers are up here because the army will tell you they are closer to God than the soldiers are. Every grave that we know of and all the graves that we don't know of, everyone has a story. Lots of them have long stories. This gentleman here arrived in England on the SS Olympic on the 7th of May 1916, and as you can see by the date, he died on the 16th. Died of pleurisy, more or less off the ship, down here into hospital and died. Never got a chance to do anything. But he's remembered the same way as people like the officer there, or the privates down there, or the early Cane. We remember them all. We don't pick and choose. They're all important. The ceremony here, the Canada Day ceremony here, originated in 1917. And the reason was, shortly before the first ceremonies, there was an air raid on Folkestone. And the Canadian soldiers from the garrison helped with the aftermath. And as a thank you, the children of the area, school children in the area, laid flowers on the graves. That was as a thank you for the help that the soldiers gave after the air raid. It's been going on ever since.
Yeah, my name's Belinda. I'm Councillor Belinda Walker of Folkestone Town Council. I'm the Mayor for this year, 2023 to 2024. I first came to Folkestone in 1995. I'm from a military family, so I was interested in going to Shorncliffe Military Cemetery at the edge of town. I discovered the Canadian war graves then, and I never thought at the time that I would be mayor one year and have the honour of laying a wreath on behalf of the town, but this year I did, and that was marvellous. It's been going since 1917, and it's to honour the 305 Canadian soldiers who fell during the Great World War I. It was originally known as Canada Flower Day, and the reason for that will become plain as we talk about the children and the part they play in. I think it's remained more or less the same. It's certainly remained the same in the years that I've been going. The mayor's function is to lay a wreath along some of the dignitaries at the memorial as part of the official ceremony. But the thing that stands out with Canada Day for me is the role the children play. Children from the local primary schools come down and they sit next to the graves of the Canadian soldiers with a little posy. And after the wreath's been laid, they lay their posies on the graves, so each individual soldier is honoured in that way. Not only that, the children have that in their lessons at school beforehand. They learn about the role of the Canadian soldiers and the role of international friendship. So we could not have stood in World War I, or indeed World War II, without the help of our friends from other countries, including, of course, Canada.
This is going to be the third stop on our trip. We've done Niagara-on-the-Lake, or Camp Niagara, where we first enlisted training. We've done Shorncliffe Military Camp and West Sandling camps, where they would have got the majority of their training in World War I. The Canadians did. Had some events in the Shorncliffe Military Cemetery. They did Canada Day. We were part of the process. Just a great day. Learned lots. Yesterday we were doing some more filming with some a local, like there was a Shorncliffe Trust, which is trying to preserve some of the lands around the garrison. So we spent the day with them. And then today it's a travel day. So we're on the ferry recreating what Robert would have basically gone through. Over to Calais, train to Arras. And then tomorrow we rent a car and we head up to Vimy Ridge and begin our filming up at Vimy. Between late 1915 until the fall of 1916, Robert, along with the 35th and several other Canadian battalions, trained at military camps in and around the Kent region of England. The training was deemed necessary in order to develop the Canadians into an effective fighting force for battle at the Western Front. During his time in Kent, Robert had been promoted to drill sergeant, but his desire was to fight, so he voluntarily took a demotion to Lance Corporal in order to fulfill his wish to travel to the front along with his fellow soldiers. Based on information we gleaned from military historians in Folkestone, the demotion was likely required since the military could not have a sergeant commanding troops at the front when that person lacked any actual fighting experience.
During the First World War, there were 3 different fronts. So it was through these 3 different fronts that worldwide aspect began, so it mobilized people from all over the world. So on the Western Front, which spanned roughly 800 kilometers, so from Belgium all the way down to the border of Switzerland, so that Western Front there, they had been entrenched warfare since 1914, so the German forces had pushed in through Belgium and through France during their Schlieffen Plan. Along the way, they chose strategic locations. They chose locations that were easy to defend and hard to take. And this was in part why this region here was chosen. So just behind their observation post around their front lines, they were right next to Hill 145, so which is the highest point of the region, 145 meters above sea level. So that height gave them a strategic advantage. There was also the fact that there was quite a lot of coal right behind them, so that access to natural resources was also important. So due to the strategic importance of the region, they were met with French forces almost immediately, and then eventually the British forces arrived in early 1916. There were some raids and some skirmishes throughout, but there had been no full attempt at capturing the actual full ridge. There was some continued fighting around the Pimple, as well as Hill 145. But then when it came to planning a full assault with the intent of taking the ridge, that was when the Canadians were brought in. So they arrived in late October, early November 1916 to start preparing for the battle that was set to take place in the beginning of April 1970. So when it came for the day of battle, all of the 30,000 infantrymen had maps on them. So these maps would help them orient themselves along the front, so 7 kilometers. And even though they knew the region, you need all the help you can get to capture those objectives. So each of the 4 Canadian divisions had been given specific objectives for the day of battle. Notably, the 4th Canadian Division was given Hill 145 as their objective. But as a result, so for the soldiers, there were roughly 3,000 of them that had been mobilized into the Grange subway. So the Grange subway was quite unwelcoming, so roughly 1.5 meters tall, about 1 meter to 1.5 meters wide as well, made up of chalk, cold, dark. So soldiers were waiting there 2 by 2 for roughly 40 hours previously to the assault. Some of them had seen fighting before, notably at the Second Battle of Ypres, where they had been met with gas. So they had a small inkling of what was waiting for them as they would go over the top. That was, however, not the case for all of the soldiers. The median age was 26, the youngest was 14, and some of them had never seen fighting before. And though they had trained, and though they knew where they were going, they knew how they were going to get there, how does one prepare for battle? How does one understand what's waiting for you? So for a lot of those soldiers, as they were making their way up towards the observation trench, or even continuing into tunnels dug into no man's land to exit there, they didn't know what was waiting for them, and they didn't know if it was the last time they would ever see the light.
You can see in the walls these divots or holes. This is where those wooden pillars would have been. So you can see one on that side, one on this side, as well as another one behind you. You can imagine those big wooden pillars, and to paint the picture, the table in the middle where officers of all ranks would have come around, pushing those pieces, trying to figure out what they wanted their strategy to be. You can imagine maps lining the walls, not of our positions, but of the German positions. And all of this information was taken during trench raids that were done. You said that your family member would have participated in these trench raids. Mm-hmm. He would have contributed to getting the information necessary to planning. And people say that one of the biggest reasons that the meal was a success was due to meticulous planning, and that was only able to happen because of all the trench raids that contributed to that information.
So these trenches here, though they are still in the original position of the observation post of the German forces, they do look drastically different from the trenches that the men would have been living in. So mind you, what we've got is cement, nice and dry cement today, would have been sandbags at the time. They would have been roughly 8 feet tall. So I can't even begin to show you how tall that would have been. And then these sandbags there, the biggest difference would have also been the ground. So today it's nice and dry. I get to keep my feet dry when I'm walking through the trenches. But at the time for the soldiers, it would have been mud. So mud up to the knee, if not up to the hip. This region here is known for being quite rainy. So to spend these long periods of time in these conditions led to the incubation of many diseases. So there was trench foot, which was when the skin of the foot would start to peel off. It could eventually lead to gangrene and oftentimes had to be rectified by amputation. There was also basically any body part along with the prefix of trench, so trench hands, trench mouth. And this is before talking about the actual diseases that could make their way through, brought over by rats and lice. And even the rats who were once a pest had also very quickly become entertainment for the soldiers. So there's not much to do in these trenches. And these were young men. They were just in the beginning of their lives. And we do see quite admirable shows of their determination. So they had rat races. There's lots of trench art that was also created. They would do effectively anything that they could to try to stay entertained, because what was waiting for them in these trenches were very long periods of relative boredom, with the constant impending risk of a shelling, a grenade, or even a trench raid. Specifically here in the region, the German forces and the Canadian forces were exceptionally close to one another.
It's called the first step.
Okay, Lindsay.
Used for the men to stand on top of and look over as well.
Are we allowed to go up?
Yeah, you can go up just the first step. Yeah. We just ask people to not go through. Can you see the top of the ground trenches?
Yeah, the top of the hill?
Yeah, exactly. Just the crater on the other side, only 45 meters away. That's the German outpost.
That's just crazy.
I know. They said they could actually hear each other speaking, and so if I was to speak at this volume back in the First World War, I could expect a shell to be sent in my direction.
So we go today on site. I'm currently from the shadow of the sun with this wonderful, lush trees. This would not have been what the battlefield would have looked like even prior to the war. So in this region, it's really farming. So there's farmers here. So they were displaced when the German forces were pushing in, and then as well as the Canadian, British, and French forces were moving forward as well. There were actually quite a few farmers that were actually stuck in that zone that the German forces were occupying. So though we often think of the Second World War when it comes to occupation, that was also still the case for those farmers there. So oftentimes they would be made to dig trenches. Sometimes they had differing levels of respect with their occupiers. Sometimes they would be quite curt. They would oftentimes trade with them as well to make sure that everyone still had enough food to eat. However, sometimes they would be less respectful, depending on the region, depending on the people as well, and how they felt about going about daily life while being occupied. But when it came to the people who were living here, most of them had to move further into France. Even in going into cities, most of the inhabitants of the town of Arras, which is the nearest large town, they were told to evacuate. Not all of them did. Some of them did stay and they did fraternize with the Canadian and the British soldiers. Once again, differing levels of respect there, really depending on the situation. But oftentimes the British and Canadian soldiers were met with smiling faces, which did lead to quite a good relationship. So here in France, I can only speak from my own experience, but whenever the Canadian accent comes out, may that be in English or in French, or when I have the small pin on my backpack, I am always met with the utmost level of respect. I, as a Canadian here, will oftentimes get thanked at work as well outside of work, not only for the contributions during the First World War, but as well as the work that has been done in conserving the site. So here at Vimy, along Beaumont Hamel, these are some of the only conserved battlefield sites that are still available from the First World War. So we are still lucky enough to have the original sections of trenches as well as tunnels going underground. So we are lucky enough to be able to actually showcase what life would have been like and exactly the strategic positions where the soldiers would have moved, how they would have moved. Just right behind me now, just right in front of me now, there's also the front line trench. So to be able to have those visual markers for commemoration as well as to help the understanding has been extremely, has been an absolute marvel. It's been an absolute pleasure to be able to hold on to this. So we get a lot of school groups, we get people from all over the world. And I will say, to be able to talk to a group of 40 or so British boys who are screaming, who are running around, who don't understand where they are and why they're there, and to be able to talk them down into a very quiet crowd, pushing each other to try to get closer to you, to ask you a question. That process there is sometimes challenging, but it is also incredibly valuable. And I think that's really the brunt of what we do here, which is to make sure that we never forget and instill everything that we are learning onto the next generation.
On November 30th, 1916, Robert, along with hundreds of other soldiers, sailed from the Folkestone Harbour in England to the front in France, where untold horrors of war in the trenches awaited their arrival. Upon arrival in France, Robert was transferred to the 46th, along with many others, in order to refortify the ranks after the 46th extremely high casualty rate coming off the Battle of the Somme, where they became known as the Suicide Battalion. The 46th arrived at Vimy Ridge in early December 1916 and were part of the 10th Brigade, along with the 44th, the 47th, and the 50th Battalions. The 10th Brigade were stationed at the extreme north end of Vimy Ridge, in the vicinity of the Pimple, or Hill 119, a heavily fortified German stronghold. Overall, Vimy Ridge was considered a key military asset, given its 60-meter height advantage above the surrounding plain, which offered clear views in all directions. The arrival of the Canadians to Vimy Ridge also coincided with one of the coldest and wettest winters in memory. The rains in Belgium and northern France turned the landscape into muck, and it was not uncommon for the soldiers to be faced with knee-deep liquid mud, along with rain and snow. So in addition to being surrounded by death and disease, the soldiers had to fight weighed down by pounds and pounds of mud coated on their bodies. Daily life experienced by Robert and the rest of the 46th at the front in December 1916 and early 1917 consisted of the monotonous and arduous task of trench shoring and assisting engineers in tunneling activities beneath the ridge during the day, followed by moments of sheer terror during the Canadian night raids and retaliatory enemy artillery bombardment during the day and night. January 29, 1917 began like many other days for Robert and the 46th. But did he know that this day, more than any other, would change his life? Or in the end, was this day no different than any other at the front? We'll never know, since no correspondence exists in our family from his time in the military. We do know, based on information in the battalion war diaries, that the day passed quietly except for a short period of enemy bombardment in retaliation for an earlier shelling by the Canadians on enemy positions. At 8 p.m., a 30-person strong contingent of soldiers, including Robert, participated in a newly proposed and lightning-quick night raid on an enemy trench coordinated with artillery shelling. The raid was broken into 3 parties, led by a lieutenant, a sergeant, and a lance corporal, who descended upon enemy trenches in the vicinity of Football and Irish craters on the Pimple, with the goal of blowing a tunnel shaft in the area. The raiding party sustained 5 wounded soldiers, including Robert, who had gunshot wounds to his right arm and leg. Robert was removed from the front by stretcher and taken by ambulance to a nearby train, where he was transported to the 100,000-person strong military camp and field hospital complex located on the sand dunes in a remote region 100 kilometers to the southeast of Vimy on the coast of France, a few kilometers north of the small village of the Tupples. The hospital complex, composed of over 20 field hospitals, was designed to treat approximately 22,000 wounded or sick at any one time. Robert arrived at the Liverpool Merchant Field Hospital, also known as British Red Cross Field Hospital No. 6, on February 1, 1917, where he received state-of-the-art medical treatment for his war wounds. However, despite the exceptional treatment provided to Robert, he unfortunately succumbed to his wounds on March 9th and was buried in the Associated Etaples Military Cemetery, which is located about 3 kilometers north of the village of the Tupples.
British Army needs to reorganize its troops before sending them to the front. So they first began in Camier, just north of here, and then extend the zone, military zone, to all the city of Étape and all the coast, and to reach 150,000 to 200,000 men just here. But the old city of Étape only had 7,000 inhabitants. So you can imagine the change for the people living there. About the Canadian hospital, it was just there, just near the road. And British soldiers came from the north, from the port of Boulogne, not in the trains, but with their feet. And the first things they saw when they arrived in Étape were the cemetery in one side of the road and the bull ring, so the training camp, and in the other side of the road. They had to cross about that to go to the barracks in the camp. And there they would stay for a few weeks to train into the bullying and for a very harsh training before going to the front. Since there were battles in the front, they needed permanent hospitals, and here it was a good place because they had space enough to develop the hospitals. So the first one was in Le Touquet, but rapidly in 1915 they decided to create a big zone for more than 20 hospitals between Étape and Camille, and they needed the doctors and nurses. So there were military nurses and voluntary nurses, and all of these people took care of the wounded soldiers, and they were put in the hospitals for the wounds they had. For example, not because it was a Canadian soldier, he was put in the Canadian hospitals. It was more about a broken bone. He was put in the Canadian hospital, which will treat broken bones, for example. And so each hospital had specialists, surgeons and nurses, and a lot of voluntary nurses too. And each one could take care for hundreds and hundreds of soldiers each day. So they came back from the front at night at 2 o'clock or 4 o'clock because the bearer stretchers took the soldiers wounded at the night, not before. They put them in the train after a quick check by medical corps, and they arrived here at night. So there were whistles in the camp to say to the ambulances to pick them at the train and bring them towards the hospitals here. So we think that when there were a lot of wounded soldiers at one place, like Vimy, for example, they need to free places and free places for the next one. So they preferred sometimes to send wounded soldiers here. The cemetery there was built after the war. The monument was built, and it was ended towards May 1922. But it didn't look like that. There were wooden crosses, for example, on the tombs, and the flowers, and no stones. They changed the wooden crosses with stones, and he decided to build a terrace of 70 meters, and this architecture to remind the families and everybody about the sacrifice of the soldiers. In each cemetery, you can see the cross and the stone of remembrance with the written a little word of Kipling. But since here there are so many tombs, they decided to have a big architecture.
Our journey is now at an end. We have traveled approximately 6,100 kilometers from the meadows of Niagara Camp in Canada to the seaside plains and hills around the former military camps near Folkestone in the UK, to Vimy Ridge, and lastly to the coastal town of Etaples, France, to the location of the former Etaples military camp and hospitals, and to the final resting place of Robert in the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Etaples Military Cemetery. It was a journey of discovery, enlightenment, education, sorrow, sadness, and a profound humbling at the horrific experiences that Robert and his fellow friends endured. It was a trip that we as siblings and a niece experienced together. A trip where we discovered the bravery and courage shown by our great uncle and his mates against the harsh realities of war. A trip where we met amazing new friends who helped tell the story of Robert and many other Canadians. We felt a sense of gratification in finding Robert's grave, and thankfulness in being able to pay our respects to Robert on behalf of the Cook family in Canada. His service in the Canadian Expeditionary Force in World War I was nothing short of extraordinary. Despite the hardships, the danger, and the losses of his friends, he remained committed to his duty, and his service was marked by bravery, courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering dedication to his country. His time in the military stood as a testament to the spirit of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. A force that, despite the odds, fought with honor and resilience and made their mark on the world stage. His journey from a volunteer in Niagara Camp to a battle-hardened soldier at Vimy Ridge is a narrative of bravery and sacrifice. Robert's role in the 46th in late 1916 and early 1917 played a hand in the success of the Canadians in winning the Battle of Vimy Ridge. So, as we reflect back on the war, we remember the service and sacrifice of soldiers like Robert, as well as the thousands of other Canadian soldiers. Their stories remind us of the cost of war, the courage of those who fight, and their enduring spirit, even in the face of unimaginable horrors and adversity.
I think it's important to keep on remembering. I've mentioned before international friendships, and I think it is so important for the young people to remember. We have a lot of military cadets in the area, but I think it's very good for the local primary school children to learn about the role the Canadian soldiers played within the First World War, and how so important these international friendships are. No country stands alone, we're no exception. So I just want to say thank you, Canada, for what you did and what you continue to do, because we have Canadian forces stationed here in Britain in Ruislip, which is just west of London. They come down every year to take part in this ceremony, and it's lovely being able to renew these friendships each year.